Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into one of history's most fascinating pandemics, the Black Death. This delightful 14th century catastrophe perfectly combined terrible hygiene, questionable medical advice, and some seriously aggressive fleas. The big question we're tackling tonight: what survival strategies actually worked? And no, just don't get sick doesn't count as a valid answer. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this content, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely appreciate what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always find it fascinating to see our global audience. Now, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for some ambient background noise, and let's begin our journey together. First crucial decision: where are you living? If your answer is a bustling 14th century city full of culture and opportunity, congratulations, you're already 85% dead. Medieval cities during the plague were nothing like those charming postcard images. They were overcrowded, filthy, and bizarrely enthusiastic about dumping waste directly into the streets. Picture thousands crammed into wooden structures with no plumbing, no sanitation, and rats so comfortable they might as well have been paying rent. Urban centers like London, Paris, and Florence became all-you-can-eat buffets for the plague. Tight quarters? Check. Open sewers? Check. Livestock living indoors? Absolutely. These cities were perfect breeding grounds for human contact, pest activity, and smells so bad they could qualify as psychological warfare. You didn't even need to be sick. Just standing near someone who could be enough. Markets, churches, the rare open bathhouse, all packed people together like sardines. Fleas loved it. Rats thrived. And you, the innocent city dweller just trying to buy some onions, were one flea bite away from complete systemic failure. Now compare this to rural areas. Sure, the countryside had downsides: isolation, unpredictable weather, the occasional aggressive goose, but crucially, it had space. Fewer neighbors, smaller crowds, and significantly reduced rat density per square foot. Living on a farm or in a remote hillside village where your nearest human was 2 goat lengths away dramatically improved survival odds. Even better, remote monasteries. Certain religious orders like the Carthusians practiced near total silence and isolation. Their lifestyle wasn't designed for plague survival, but accidentally created the medieval equivalent of an elite quarantine bubble. Bottom line: if you valued your lungs, your blood, and your continued existence in 1348, your best move was to get as far from other humans as possible, legally or otherwise. Cancel all travel plans, leave markets early, and if anyone says it's probably not that bad, consider that your cue to grab your cloak and sprint for the city gates. Imagine this scenario. It's 1349, and someone sneezes in your general direction. Do you A. politely ask if they're okay, B. offer them garlic, or C. run like your life depends on it, because it does? The correct answer is always C. While medieval people didn't understand viruses, they grasped one crucial concept. If someone near you started sweating, coughing, or bleeding from unusual places, it was time to become a hermit. What we now call social distancing didn't have a catchy name yet, but survivors practiced it religiously. The plague was thought to spread through bad air, miasma theory. Not entirely accurate since fleas were the real culprits, but avoiding humans who smelled like death was accidentally excellent advice. Those who retreated early to rural areas, whether family cottages or anywhere not full of suspicious coughing, had dramatically better survival odds. Entire families survived by simply locking their doors and not opening them until next year. Did this strain relationships? Absolutely. Was it awkward when your cousin showed up begging for soup while sneezing through the keyhole? Incredibly. But letting them in could mean everyone would be dead by Sunday. Sorry, cousin Gregory, no soup for you. Some wealthy families fled cities at the first plague signs. The wealthy Boccaccio family, for example, packed up and left Florence, practicing social distancing with wine, poetry, and zero peasant contact. Smart move. Meanwhile, the less fortunate learned isolation through trial and error, mostly error. Markets, festivals, weddings, any large gathering became microbial Russian roulette. Those with willpower to skip events, stay home, and talk to their cats instead of neighbors had a real shot at outliving the pandemic. The equation was simple. Every human interaction was a potential death sentence. While medieval people didn't have Twitter threads about flattening the curve, they quickly realized fewer handshakes meant more birthdays. Now let's talk fashion, specifically how your wardrobe choices could literally kill you in 1348. The medieval upper class adored long flowing robes with fur-trimmed sleeves, outfits that screamed, "I'm wealthy and definitely not planning any quick escapes." But to fleas, these weren't fashion statements. They were five-star resorts. The plague didn't discriminate between rich and poor. If you had fabric and skin, you were fair game. Ironically, the more layers you wore, the more real estate you provided for fleas to set up shop and start families. Your fashion sense essentially functioned as a luxury hotel chain for parasites. What actually worked? Simplicity. Survivors tended toward shorter tunics, less fabric, tighter sleeves, and linen, the one material fleas didn't seem particularly fond of. Bonus points if you washed your clothes more than once per season, which, yes, was considered excessive by medieval standards. Some communities took drastic measures, burning entire wardrobes believing the disease clung to cloth. Not entirely wrong since fleas could survive days without a host, happily hitchhiking on your favorite velvet cloak. That fancy squirrel fur trim? Not so impressive when it's doubling as a plague delivery system. People also wore accessories, lots of them. But those beaded necklaces, perfumed sachets, and rosemary bundles weren't actually stopping the plague. Unless you count making everyone keep their distance from your overwhelming scent. In which case, well played. And for those wondering about armor, no, it didn't help either. You couldn't exactly sword fight microscopic pathogens, though dying in full plate because you refused to remove your gauntlets to wash your hands would have been very on-brand for certain nights. If you hoped to survive the Black Death, geography wasn't just about scenery. It could literally save your skin, especially if that skin was located far uphill. Medieval science had gaps, to put it mildly, but they noticed patterns, like how people living at higher elevations didn't drop dead as quickly as those in swampy lowlands. Coincidence? Maybe. But when your neighbor's corpse toppled over the fence, you probably weren't sticking around to demand peer-reviewed studies. Elevation offered several sneaky advantages. First, rats. Those furry little plague taxis hated climbing. Or more accurately, they disliked staying at elevations where food was scarce and temperatures dropped. The colder the hill, the less likely you were to host a flea convention. Second, wind. Higher ground meant better air circulation. While bad air, miasma, wasn't actually causing the plague, escaping those stagnant, putrid city alleys for crisp hilltop breezes was still a smart move. If nothing else, it spared you the olfactory assault of medieval urban life, a unique blend of human waste, animal hair, and existential dread. Hills also came with built-in social distancing. Fewer people meant fewer transmission vectors. The plague couldn't spread if there was no one to catch it and no one breathing on you at the communal water barrel. Some monasteries and manors were already strategically built on high ground, not for plague reasons, but because their occupants liked the view and hated invaders. When the Black Death arrived, these locations became unexpectedly ideal. You didn't need wealth to head uphill either. Even shepherds, goat herds, and that one guy who talked to birds had the right idea. Fresh air, minimal neighbors, and a steep walk that deterred both plague carriers and unannounced visitors. And if someone from the valley came trudging up coughing with some story about just a cold, you had every excuse to roll a barrel downhill in self-defense. Now let's address the obvious. Medieval people weren't exactly famous for their love of soap, water, or personal space. By the 14th century, Europe's brief bathing renaissance had hit a snag. Earlier medieval periods actually had public bathhouses, some quite elaborate, but by the Black Death era, bathing was viewed with deep suspicion. Medical experts, and I use that term generously, believed hot water opened pores, making you more vulnerable to disease. In other words, they thought cleanliness invited death, the exact opposite of reality. Let's be brutally honest. Medieval doctors were men of supreme confidence, questionable hygiene, and theories that would make modern scientists weep. If you felt plague symptoms creeping in during 1349 and thought, I should call a doctor, congratulations, you've just made your final mistake. To be fair, these physicians were doing their best with what little they understood, which was essentially nothing. The prevailing medical theory of the time revolved around the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you got sick, it supposedly meant your humors were out of balance. The solution? Drain something. Usually blood, occasionally dignity. So you'd show up coughing blood, and their brilliant response would be to stick leeches on you until you resembled a deflated wineskin. Or worse, they'd slice open a vein to let the bad out, which had the unfortunate side effect of also letting you out, permanently. Then there were the infamous plague doctors with their bird-beaked masks stuffed with flowers and herbs. That beak wasn't a fashion statement. It was their primitive version of PPE. They believed good smells could ward off bad air. Not entirely wrong if you consider that overwhelming floral scents might keep people at a distance. Their toolkit included wooden sticks for poking patients from a safe distance, a cane for nudging corpses into mass graves when treatments failed, and enough burning sage to fumigate a cathedral. Treatment options range from useless to downright dangerous. Rubbing onions in your armpits, drinking crushed emeralds, carrying a dead toad around your neck like some cursed necklace, sitting in smoke-filled rooms until you coughed up both lungs. Basically, if a remedy sounded painful, stupid, or highly flammable, it was probably standard procedure. The tragic irony? Those who fared best were often the ones who avoided medical attention altogether. Nuns, midwives, and herbalists who relied on basic hygiene, clean bandages, and staying calm actually had better survival rates. Meanwhile, in the midst of all this medical madness, one group quietly outperformed everyone else in the survival game: monks. Not just any monks. We're talking about the silent, stay away from everyone types like the Carthusians. Why did monastic life offer such plague-proof potential? Let's break it down. Location: monasteries were often isolated, perched on hillsides or nestled in rural nowhere. Designed for prayer and reflection, not overcrowded inns where everyone shared the same plague-infested soup bowl. Rules: monastic life came with structure, scheduled meals, strict sanitation by medieval standards, and a refreshing lack of handshakes or hugs. Group bathhouse orgies? Absolutely forbidden. Resources: they had consistent access to food and clean water. Critical when most of the population was too sick to farm or boil water properly. Monasteries stored grain, grew herbs, and didn't rely on rat-infested urban markets. Celibacy: no late-night tavern visits meant significantly reduced exposure risks. Just you, your thoughts, and some Latin chants for company. Now, not all monks survived. Some chose to act as caregivers, venturing into cities to help the sick. Noble? Absolutely. Statistically unwise? Definitely. Traveling clergy had the worst of both worlds. Maximum exposure with minimal ability to flee, because abandoning the sick would look bad in the Bible. The takeaway? If you wanted the monk survival advantage without taking vows, you just needed to copy their habits. Live remotely, grow your own food, and limit contact with the general plague-ridden population. Your antisocial tendencies would finally pay off. Certain professions during the Black Death came with built-in hazards, immediate exposure to everyone's germs. Let's start with messengers, those unfortunate souls whose job was riding between towns delivering letters, royal decrees, and plague strains. Great cardio, terrible survival odds. Every scroll handed over was essentially a microbial handshake with whoever had last sneezed on the parchment. Then there were merchants, the Uber Eats of the 14th century, minus the hygiene and customer satisfaction. These traveling salesmen moved between cities, markets, and ports, helpfully transporting spices, fabrics, and fleas from one infected location to another. They were plague superspreaders before the term existed. If you worked these jobs, you were basically a human petri dish with a death wish. So which professions offered better odds? The relatively safe, hard jobs. Blacksmiths worked with fire. Bakers handled heat-treated food. Shepherds worked alone with animals. Millers isolated with their grain. These folks didn't need to travel or shake hands with strangers. They could mostly avoid plague-saturated cities and questionable meetings that could have been handled by parchment. Then there were gravediggers, morbid but oddly secure employment. While the job wasn't exactly plague-proof, they had advantages like gloves, shovels, and the underrated strategy of not touching corpses with their faces. Some even learned to recognize early plague symptoms and took pride in not dying like everyone around them. If you were really lucky, you could be a recluse, a hermit, that mildly disliked goat herder nobody visited. Suddenly, antisocial behavior became wise pandemic planning. Even artisans like cobblers and weavers fared decently, working from home with limited client contact, able to claim they were booked solid when sketchy, coughing customers came knocking. The brutal truth of 1349: the fewer errands you ran, the longer you lived. Your best career move was becoming really boring and really hard to find. Let's get one thing straight. In plague-ravaged Europe, rats weren't just background noise. They were starring actors in this horror show, furry little death chariots with one mission: get into your food and leave behind a parting gift called Yersinia pestis. If you wanted to survive the Black Death, one of your smartest moves, besides fleeing cities and avoiding humans, was to elevate your pantry, literally. Grain bins left on the floor? That's basically throwing a rat rave. Open baskets of bread under your bed? Congratulations, you've just opened a plague-themed buffet. Rats weren't picky eaters, and neither were their fleas. The moment rodents set up shop near your food stores, your chances of seeing next Lent dropped faster than your grain reserves. Some medieval households wised up to this. They stored food on high wooden shelves, in ceramic jars with tight lids, in suspended boxes hanging from ceilings like bizarre piñatas nobody was allowed to hit. These weren't aesthetic choices. They were desperate attempts to keep plague at tail's length. And then there were cats, the unsung heroes of rodent control. The more felines patrolling your kitchen, the better your odds. Tragically, some communities accused cats of being witches' familiars and killed them off, which, spoiler alert, made the rat situation exponentially worse. Hard to survive when you've executed your best line of defense. Let's talk trash management, or lack thereof. Tossing scraps out the window wasn't just lazy. It was basically sending out rat invitations. Same with leaving compost piles right next to your house, like some rodent Airbnb. Smart survivors moved waste far from living quarters, preferably into someone else's yard. Out of sight, out of mind, out of flea range. It's worth noting that rats themselves didn't technically cause the plague, their fleas did. But fleas don't travel long distances alone. They needed those furry Uber drivers to spread the misery. This biological nuance was completely lost on medieval people, who just knew that where rats went, death followed. When disaster strikes, humanity tends to split into two camps: those seeking rational solutions, and those forming torch-wielding mobs convinced it's all the neighbor's fault. Guess which approach was more popular in 1348? The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it shattered minds. With no germ theory, microscopes, or competent leadership, people invented explanations, most boiling down to: it must be them. Mobs accused: outsiders, Jewish communities, foreigners, anyone who looked suspiciously healthy, elderly women with too many cats, people who bathed weirdly often. The logic was impeccable. If you weren't sick yet, you must be causing it. Some believed wells were poisoned, others that the plague was divine punishment. The solutions? Pitchforks, torches, and wildly misdirected violence. Smart. These mob gatherings were ironically perfect plague spreaders, sweaty crowds yelling in each other's faces while swapping bacteria like trading cards. You weren't just risking moral catastrophe by joining. You were volunteering for direct exposure to the very disease you wanted to blame on someone else. The actual survivors were often those who kept low profiles, didn't attend protest rallies against imaginary witches, boarded up windows quietly, boiled water without fanfare, basically minded their own damn business. While mobs were busy dragging astrologers through streets for reading stars too confidently, Smart people were practicing the original see something, say nothing policy. There's a lesson here. Panic spreads faster than plague, and angry crowds are rarely good problem solvers. Unless you enjoy the aroma of smoke, moral failure, and guaranteed exposure to cough droplets, maybe skip the torchlight processions. Because in a pandemic, the only thing more contagious than disease is weaponized ignorance. Garlic, nature's breath mint, cooking staple, and medieval equivalent of Axe body spray. When plague hit, people lacked vaccines, antibiotics, or even basic germ theory. What they had was garlic, and they used it for everything. Ate it raw, hung it over doors, wore it around necks like aromatic talismans. Probably bathed in it, we're guessing. Was it scientifically effective? Let's be real, not really. But compared to alternatives like bathing in vinegar, drinking molten gold, or letting someone drill holes in your skull to release bad air, garlic was practically evidence-based medicine. Why garlic? 3 reasons. It smelled strong, critical when bad air was blamed. It had mild antibacterial properties, accidentally helpful. It repelled fleas, the actual plague carriers. Modern science confirms garlic does have antimicrobial effects, so medieval folks stumbled onto something useful despite their complete misunderstanding. That said, don't give garlic too much credit. You couldn't just rub a clove on your forehead and waltz through corpse piles unscathed. If you were still, wearing flea-infested robes, visiting sick neighbors, drinking from communal cups at funeral feasts, no amount of garlic would save you. You'd just die extra flavorful. Some people ate so much garlic they became socially isolated by default, which ironically helped with social distancing. The lesson? Even when you're wrong about why something works, sometimes being right by accident is enough. In the 14th century, being able to smell something pleasant like roses wasn't just nice, it was diagnostic. If your nose still functioned, congratulations, you probably weren't dead yet. This logic spawned the posy, small herb bouquets carried as primitive air filters. These weren't romantic gestures, but DIY gas masks containing a lavender, mint, sage, rose petals. You'd clutch these like lifelines, stuff them in sleeves, or basically glue them to your face. Did they work? Not medically, but psychologically? Absolutely. Carrying flowers made you look proactive, which put you ahead of roughly half the population. The reasoning tied back to miasma theory. Overpowering death stench with floral aromas cleansed the air. In reality, you were just giving yourself something pleasant to focus on besides impending doom. People who used flowers and herbs tended to be those who could afford isolation, wash occasionally, avoid plague epicenters, basically had survival advantages beyond botany. Wealthier households took this further with indoor flower arrangements, burning incense, simmering herb pots, not because they were aromatherapy pioneers, but because living with 10 relatives in one room required serious odor management. This accidental hygiene might have saved lives by masking body odors that attracted fleas, encouraging slightly cleaner habits, keeping windows open for fresh air. The takeaway? When your entire medical framework is wrong, sometimes the behaviors it inspires accidentally line up with what actually helps. Even broken clocks are right twice a day. Let's face it, the plague wasn't just testing your immune system, it was testing your social calendar. In an era where human contact was about as safe as licking a dagger, having friends suddenly became problematic. Every hug, handshake, or shared drinking horn was basically playing bacterial roulette. And the people who came out on top? The ones who politely declined all invitations. Forever. Medieval survivors were often the quiet types who lived boring, drama-free lives. Not because they were brilliant epidemiologists, but because they just weren't that into people to begin with. Basically, introverts had their moment to shine. That neighbor who always said, "I'll stop by later," and never did? Alive. The couple who skipped every festival, wedding, and Saints' Day party? Still kicking. The weird guy who muttered to his chickens in the shed? Odd, but breathing. Here's the cold math. More friends equals more chances for the plague to hitch a ride into your home. Even well-meaning gestures turned deadly. Bringing soup to a sick neighbor? Risky. Checking on elderly auntie? Potentially fatal. Group prayer circles? Holy but horrifically contagious. Smart survivors limited contact to immediate family, and even that came with rules. Eat separately. Avoid suspicious coughing. Build 2 houses and shout through windows if necessary. If someone sneezed, that was basically the medieval version of getting blocked on all social media. Permanently. Monasteries and noble households got creative with early quarantine measures. Sick person shows symptoms? Move them to another wing. Too poor for extra wings? The barn will do. Check back next week, if they're still alive. Here's the uncomfortable truth nobody likes to admit. Sometimes surviving the Black Death came down to dumb luck. Sure, good choices helped. Washing occasionally, skipping festivals, not licking strangers. Basic stuff, really. But even if you did everything right, one flea with an attitude could ruin your whole career. That said, your odds improved dramatically if you were extremely boring, genetically lucky, both. Why boring? Because excitement in the 14th century usually involved people, movement, noise, very bad decisions. It was the social butterflies, the wanderers, the just popping into town crowd who tended to RSVP to funerals they didn't realize were their own. Meanwhile, the survivors? They embraced monotony like a lifestyle brand. The plague didn't care about your charisma, your ambitions, your dream of opening a tavern in Bruges. It only cared if you were within biting distance. So the guy who spent his days counting turnips and complaining about the weather? Not immune exactly, but invisible to danger? Pretty much. Then there were the genetic lottery winners. Modern scientists think some people carried mutations, like the CCR5 delta 32 gene, that made them more resistant. They didn't know this at the time, of course. They just went around thinking, weird that I'm not bleeding from my eyeballs like everyone else. So if you were naturally antisocial, fond of boiled water, weirdly attached to your cat, genetically fortunate, congratulations, you were basically medieval elite. But the moment you got adventurous, tried a new city, hosted friends, joined a flagellant parade, or drank from that sketchy communal cup at the market, game over. Boring meant predictable. Predictable meant fewer surprises. And fewer surprises meant no mysterious rashes, no spontaneous organ failure, more birthdays. If you somehow made it through the coughing, bleeding, and streets that smelled like death's armpit, congrats, you've officially entered plague survivor territory. Now comes your final test, making sure someone remembers you were here. Because surviving wasn't just about not dying. It was about being remembered for not dying. Enter the scribes, the diary keepers, the monks with too much time and trauma. These were the real MVPs. They didn't just outlive everyone. They had the energy to write about it. People like Giovanni Boccaccio, who gave us the Decameron, basically wealthy Florentines telling stories while hiding from the plague. Or that random monk in Yorkshire who scribbled in the margins. A great pestilence came and many died. Minimalist, but effective. Writing things down became more than therapy. It was processing trauma, warning future generations, a low-key bragging about your immune system. Survivors who recorded their stories shaped how we understand the plague today. In doing so, they turned not dying into the ultimate flex. But here's the catch. You had to survive the editing process. That meant staying cautious even when things seemed better. Many got cocky too soon. Threw victory parties. Reunited with probably clean relatives. Hosted "We Survived" feasts. Then died in the second wave. The real pros? They waited. Stayed boring. Kept writing. Observed. And when it was actually truly safe, they picked up their quills and went to work. Maybe no one would read it. Maybe it would gather dust in an attic. But maybe, just maybe, some future historian would find it and say this person knew what they were doing. Because surviving a pandemic is impressive, but surviving with receipts? That's legendary. Long before psychiatry earned its name, mental illness was never seen as a medical condition, but rather as divine messages or curses. In ancient Mesopotamia, when someone experienced hallucinations, spoke incoherently, or acted erratically, the immediate assumption wasn't madness, it was possession. The Sumerians firmly believed evil spirits could invade human bodies and seize control. A disturbed mind signaled that demons had claimed the soul. The earliest recorded treatments weren't based on science or logic, but on a potent mix of ritual, prayer, and magic. Clay tablets from Assyria detail elaborate incantations designed to expel these spiritual invaders. Exorcists commanded more trust than physicians. These weren't fringe beliefs practiced in shadows. They were mainstream medical diagnostics. Ancient Egypt followed similar patterns. The Ebers Papyrus, among the oldest medical documents in existence, records both physiological and spiritual explanations for strange behaviors. If you wept without cause, forgot your own name, or withdrew from society, you might be suffering from a wandering womb or divine punishment. Treatments included aromatherapy sessions, ritual purification baths, desperate appeals to gods for intervention. They believed the heart, not the brain, housed human thought, showing how fundamentally their understanding differed from ours. The Greeks elevated these concepts to new levels. In Homeric epics, madness often arrives as divine interference, like when Ajax slaughters sheep, mistaking them for enemies during a god-sent delusion. Divine madness became so ingrained in Greek culture that it was sometimes celebrated as inspiration. Plato himself argued certain forms of madness were gifts from the gods, conduits to prophetic visions, artistic genius, poetic enlightenment. Poets weren't mentally ill, they were divinely chosen. Yet not all Greek thought remained mystical. Hippocrates, often called the father of modern medicine, proposed a more physical explanation. He blamed imbalances in the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Melancholia, what we'd now call depression, stemmed from black bile excess. His treatments, diet adjustments, rest, lifestyle changes, were remarkably progressive for 460 BCE. This created an enduring duality. Was mental illness spiritual possession or chemical imbalance? A divine curse or physiological disorder? The line between healer and priest remained razor thin. Depending on where and when you lived, the voices in your head could earn you a temple or a burial. Medieval Europe abandoned all Greek nuance regarding mental health. Gone were philosophical debates about divine inspiration or humoral balance. Instead, the church dominated the conversation, bringing fire, brimstone, and absolute terror to the discussion. If you heard voices or saw visions, the explanation wasn't neurological imbalance. It was sin. Or worse, Satan himself. Madness became framed exclusively through religious lenses. The mentally ill were viewed as morally corrupt, spiritually weak, willfully possessed. The devil served as chief diagnostician. A peasant woman wandering streets muttering to herself? Probably a witch. A nobleman weeping uncontrollably for days? Harboring unconfessed sins. Prescriptions included compulsory confessions, self-flagellation, marathon prayer sessions. Physicians deferred to priests. Institutional care was virtually non-existent. Most mentally ill individuals were left to wander countryside roads, rot in dungeon cells, overcrowded monasteries. Some towns publicly chained them in squares where locals could poke them with sticks, throw coins at them, treat human suffering as street theater. Bethlehem Royal Hospital, Bedlam, in London, founded in the 13th century, became one of the first dedicated mental institutions. But care wasn't the priority, containment was. Bedlam quickly devolved into a human zoo where visitors paid admission to gawk at patients chained to walls or howling behind bars. Treatments included ice water dunking, bloodletting, whipping sessions. The theory was simple: beat the devil out of them. Yet amidst this horror, faint glimmers of humanity appeared. Some monks offered genuine kindness and shelter. Islamic physicians like Avicenna, operating beyond the Inquisition's reach, still promoted humoral theory with compassionate care. In Moorish Spain, hospitals treated the mentally ill with music therapy, fresh air, dignity. But in Christendom, mercy was rare and ignorance ruled. Madness became a term soaked in dread. You didn't receive help, you got chains. You didn't find healing, you found exile. For most medieval sufferers, the world offered only a dungeon cell, an exhausted priest, prayers nobody believed in. The age of madness had begun, and it would take centuries before compassion caught up to cruelty. The Renaissance, often romanticized as Europe's great reawakening, brought only partial enlightenment to mental health care. As classical knowledge resurfaced, so too did Hippocrates and Galen's medical theories, loosening the Church's stranglehold on psychiatric explanations. For the first time in centuries, madness was permitted to have physical causes again, not just spiritual ones. But this progress came with its own set of complications and contradictions. Physicians began reframing mental illness through anatomical lenses rather than demonic ones. Terms like melancholia, hysteria, and mania regained medical legitimacy, theoretically treated with dietary regimens, physical exercise, calm environments. Astrology surprisingly re-entered the picture too, with planetary alignments blamed for emotional instability, as if Saturn's position could explain your uncle's erratic behavior. Yet for all this apparent advancement, Renaissance treatments remained disturbingly crude. Bloodletting persisted as standard practice. Violent purging continued. For agitated patients, options included days and restraints, spinning chairs designed to reset the brain, ice baths that risked hypothermia. Institutions grew more common across Italy and France, not due to newfound compassion, but to remove the mentally ill from public view. These asylums functioned more like human warehouses than healing centers. One voice rose above the ignorance. Johann Weyer, a Dutch physician who dared challenge prevailing witch hunt hysteria. In the mid-1500s, Weyer boldly claimed many accused witches were simply mentally ill women needing medical care, not execution. His treatise, De Prestigiis Daemonum, on the tricks of demons, systematically debunked witch trial logic, arguing that demonic possession explanations prevented proper diagnosis. Torture-induced confessions were worthless. Mental illness required treatment, not burning. Unsurprisingly, the Church banned his books and suppressed his ideas. Meanwhile, European rulers weaponized madness diagnoses against political enemies. Unwanted wives, inconvenient heirs, and rebellious thinkers could be conveniently declared insane and imprisoned indefinitely. No trials, no evidence needed. Mental illness became less a medical condition than a political tool. Art and literature of the period reflected these contradictions. Shakespeare's tragic heroes, from Ophelia's flower-strewn madness to King Lear's spiraling delusions, captured mental illness with unprecedented nuance. Paintings like Durer's Melancholia I depicted depression as a philosophical condition rather than moral failing. Yet in daily life, most sufferers still faced family shame, social ostracization, institutional neglect. The Enlightenment promised rationality and scientific progress, but its approach to mental health proved equally inconsistent. The asylum system expanded dramatically, with imposing structures built far from city centers, less hospitals than human dumping grounds. In London, Paris, and Vienna, these institutions prioritized isolation over treatment, containment over care, silence over healing. French physician Philippe Pinel famously unchained asylum inmates in 1793, a gesture hailed as revolutionary. Yet the reality proved less idealistic. While patients might be freed from physical restraints, they faced new forms of control: forced feeding, ice water therapy, endless lectures on moral behavior. Moral treatment became the new buzzword, the idea that mental illness stemmed from bad habits requiring strict discipline. Patients endured military-style routines, mandatory chapel attendance, regimented bed-making, forced smiling at authorities. Compliance equaled recovery in this system. Britain's York Retreat, run by Quakers, offered a gentler alternative emphasizing peaceful gardens, respectful care, quiet reflection. But such humane models remained exceptions in an era when doctors began keeping detailed patient records, not to improve treatment, but to classify and categorize human suffering. Psychiatry inched towards scientific legitimacy while often reducing patients to clinical specimens. Less demonized than before, but equally dehumanized. The Enlightenment's cold rationality brought order to madness studies, yet at the cost of basic empathy, a trade-off that would haunt mental health care into the modern era. The Victorian era perfected the art of contradiction, an age of rigid morality masking profound social fractures, where scientific breakthroughs collided with grotesque medical barbarism. Nowhere was this duality more apparent than in the treatment of mental illness, particularly for women. In a society obsessed with appearances, madness became the ultimate crack in civilization's porcelain veneer. For women, that crack had a specific diagnosis: hysteria. Derived from the Greek hystera, womb, this catch-all condition pathologized everything that made Victorian men uncomfortable. Mood swings hysteria, sexual desire hysteria, refusing marriage hysteria, reading novels probably hysteria. It was medicine as patriarchal enforcement, a diagnostic straitjacket that medicalized female autonomy. Treatments ranged from absurd to abusive. Vibratory therapy, exactly what it sounds like. Mandatory marriage. Forced childbirth. The infamous rest cure. Weeks of bed confinement banning all mental stimulation. Dr. Silas, where Mitchell's rest cure became particularly notorious. Patients, overwhelmingly women, were isolated in darkened rooms, forbidden to read, write, or converse, fed milk and fat until weight gained supposedly calmed nerves. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's autobiographical short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, laid bare the treatment's horrors, the protagonist descending into madness while confined under similar conditions. The irony? Mitchell had prescribed Gilman this cure after she experienced postpartum depression. Her literary protest became one of medicine's most damning indictments. Meanwhile, male hysteria took a different form. Jean-Martin Charcot's Parisian hospital lectures turned female patients into spectacle. At Salpêtrière Hospital, crowds gathered to watch. Hypnotized women convulsing. Theatrical, hysterical fits. Medical voyeurism disguised as science. Charcot believed he was advancing neurology. Critics saw exploitation. Among his audience, a young Sigmund Freud, taking notes that would later birth psychoanalysis, though his theories about penis envy and female sexuality would prove equally problematic. Victorian asylums became sprawling complexes, their high walls and barred windows embodying society's fear of mental difference. These institutions weren't for healing. They were dumping grounds for the inconvenient. Epileptics, alcoholics, rebellious daughters, elderly parents with dementia, anyone deemed difficult. Admission required one signature. Discharge? Nearly impossible. The public maintained appearances through elaborate fictions. Families lied about institutionalized relatives. Obituaries omitted asylum deaths. Newspapers coded mental illness as nervous exhaustion. Madness became the ultimate social stain, a threat to marriage prospects, employment, and basic personhood. The asylum was society's broom closet, where unwanted minds were swept away. Treatment wasn't the goal, invisibility was. Yet even in this darkness, glimmers of reform emerged. Dorothea Dix's crusade exposed asylum abuses across America and Europe, leading to improved facilities, trained staff, separation of violent and nonviolent patients. Photography became an unexpected tool for understanding mental illness. Hugh Diamond's asylum portraits attempted to document symptoms objectively, reduce stigma through imagery, identify facial markers of conditions. These efforts, while flawed, represented tentative steps toward medicalizing rather than demonizing mental difference. The Victorians built the foundations of modern psychiatry even as they exemplified its worst excesses, a paradox that continues to haunt mental health care today. The 20th century opened with a seismic event that would forever change how the world understood mental trauma: World War I. In the trenches of Europe, doctors encountered something they couldn't bleed, exorcise, or hypnotize away: battle-hardened soldiers reduced to trembling shells of men. These weren't cowards or weaklings. They were warriors broken by industrialized warfare. The symptoms defied existing medical frameworks. Uncontrollable shaking, Nightmares replaying artillery barrages. Sudden muteness despite uninjured vocal cords. Men screaming at phantom gunfire. At first, physicians called it shell shock, believing exploding munitions caused literal brain damage from concussive waves. But the horrifying truth soon became clear: the human mind had limits. The unrelenting horrors of trench warfare, constant bombardment, rotting corpses, mud-filled hellscapes, could shatter even the strongest psyches. Military commanders initially dismissed it as weakness, malingering, moral failure. Some British soldiers were executed for desertion when they were actually mentally incapacitated. But as cases multiplied into the tens of thousands, even the most hardened generals couldn't ignore the crisis. The military medical response evolved through 3 brutal years. 1914, lack of moral fiber, punishable offense. 1915, neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion. 1917, war neurosis, legitimate medical condition. Pioneering doctors like W.H.R. Rivers at Craig Lockhart War Hospital developed revolutionary treatments. Talk therapy sessions, dream analysis, encouraging creative expression. His most famous patient, poet Siegfried Sassoon, processed trauma through verse, writing some of the war's most powerful anti-war poetry during treatment. This marked a paradigm shift. Mental illness wasn't sin or weakness, but injury. When World War II erupted, military psychiatry had advanced significantly. Shell shock was replaced with combat fatigue, recognizing that prevention mattered as much as treatment. Frontline units needed psychiatric support. Early intervention reduced long-term damage. Armies implemented forward treatment centers where soldiers received 48-hour rest periods, hot meals, brief counseling, medication when needed. The goal? Stabilize and return troops to combat. A pragmatic approach that nonetheless acknowledged psychological wounds as real battle injuries. Yet stigma persisted. Veterans still faced disbelief from civilians, employment discrimination, inadequate VA support. The war's psychological legacy rippled through culture. Hemingway's terse, traumatized heroes, Wilfred Owen's haunting war poetry, film noir's psychologically damaged protagonists. Post-war America saw the rise of veterans' mental health advocacy, pushing for specialized VA psychiatric wards, disability benefits for mental conditions, recognition of PTSD, finally added to DSM in 1980. World War I's psychiatric crisis forced medicine to confront an uncomfortable truth. Under sufficient stress, any mind could break. This realization would eventually lead to modern trauma psychology, evidence-based therapies, reduced reliance on institutionalization. But progress came too late for thousands of soldiers condemned as cowards when they were actually casualties. Men whose invisible wounds bled long after the guns fell silent. As the world staggered from world wars into the Cold War's shadow, psychiatry took a radical, and often horrifying, turn toward physical interventions. The 1940s to 1950s became the era of heroic medicine, where doctors wielded scalpels and electrodes like medieval surgeons brandishing leeches, convinced they could cut or shock mental illness into submission. The lobotomy emerged as the most infamous procedure. Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz introduced prefrontal lobotomy in 1935, severing brain connections to reduce agitation. His reward? A Nobel Prize in 1949. But the true horror began when American Walter Freeman streamlined the procedure into ice pick lobotomies. No surgery suite needed, just a mallet and orbital pick. 10-minute office procedures. Over 3,500 performed by Freeman alone. Patients became docile at catastrophic costs. Lost personalities, blunted emotions, permanent childlike states. 15% mortality rate. One survivor described it as having my soul scooped out with an ice cream spoon. Yet institutions kept ordering the procedure, not because it cured, but because it made patients manageable. Success measured in empty beds. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, arrived with similar fanfare. Early versions administered jolts, without anesthesia, without consent. strong enough to fracture bones, causing permanent memory loss. While modern ECT is far safer, its brutal origins left lasting scars on psychiatry's reputation. This was medicine's darkest hour, treating minds like broken machines needing violent repairs. The 1960s brought a revolution: deinstitutionalization. Investigative journalists exposed asylum horrors, over-medicated zombies, feces-smeared walls, restraint deaths, rampant abuse. Three forces drove change: new antipsychotic drugs, Thorazine, civil rights lawsuits, state budget cuts. President Kennedy, whose sister Rosemary was lobotomized into disability, signed the 1963 Community Mental Health Act, promising local treatment centers, outpatient care, dignified living. But good intentions crashed into harsh realities. Only half the promised centers opened. Released patients faced no housing, no jobs, no follow-up care. Many became homeless, 30% of urban homeless in 1980s. Incarcerated, jails became de facto asylums. Revolving door hospital admissions. The 1990s saw both progress and backlash. Prozac revolutionized depression treatment. Brain chemistry explanations reduced stigma. But overprescription created new crises. Today's mental health care remains a paradox. We've never had more effective medications, evidence-based therapies, neurological understanding. Yet access remains catastrophically unequal. Rural areas lack providers. Minorities face diagnostic bias. 60% of counties lack psychiatric beds. The ghosts of history haunt every advancement. Asylum shadows in homeless camps. Lobotomies echo in overmedication. Moral treatment's legacy in compliance-focused care. But there's hope in trauma-informed approaches, peer support specialists, integrated physical/mental care, hard-won consumer rights. From demonic possession to chemical imbalances, our understanding has evolved. Yet the fundamental questions remain. How do we heal minds without breaking spirits? When does treatment become control? What does true recovery look like? The history of mental health care isn't just about medicine. It's about humanity's endless struggle to understand itself. And perhaps that's the most important diagnosis of all. The digital age has rewritten the rules of mental health care with the speed of a software update, yet eerily echoes ancient struggles. Teletherapy platforms now connect patients to psychiatrists across continents, a far cry from medieval exorcisms, until you consider both attempt to heal invisible wounds through intangible connections. Our smartphones have become the new amulets, buzzing with therapy apps instead of protective herbs. But the core human need remains unchanged: relief from suffering. Modern psychiatry walks a tightrope between overcorrection and neglect. The same society that once chained the mentally ill now overdiagnoses childhood ADHD during 15-minute pediatric visits, prescribes antidepressants like candy, pathologizes normal grief as prolonged bereavement disorder. Pharmaceutical solutions have saved countless lives, but created new dilemmas. 1 in 6 Americans takes psychiatric medication. 70% of antidepressants prescribed by primary care doctors, not psychiatrists. Teen antidepressant use doubled since 2010. We've traded asylums for wellness culture, equally coercive in its own way. The same influencers who destigmatize anxiety disorders also peddle $120 anxiety-reducing weighted blankets, pseudoscientific brain detox regimens, self-diagnosis via TikTok's symptoms lists. Meanwhile, the ghosts of institutionalization persist in subtler forms. Schools medicating disruptive kids instead of reforming classrooms. Employers offering mental health days while maintaining toxic work cultures. Prison psych wards replacing straitjackets with chemical restraints. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed these fault lines brutally. As lockdowns lifted, therapists faced tsunami-like demand revealing. 40% of Americans reported anxiety/depression symptoms. Pre-pandemic, 11%. 6-month waitlist for child psychiatrists. Therapists rejecting insurance to survive. Yet crisis breeds innovation. Digital tools now offer AI chatbots for cognitive behavioral therapy, VR exposure therapy for PTSD, algorithm-powered suicide risk detection. These advances carry their own ethical quandaries. Can algorithms truly understand human suffering? Does automated therapy depersonalize healing? Who owns your therapy chat logs? Perhaps most revolutionary is the consumer movement, patients demanding shared decision-making and treatment plans, trauma-informed care standards, rejection of doctor knows best paternalism. The pendulum swings between extremes, from medieval demonization to Victorian institutionalization, from lobotomies' brutality to today's overprescription. Yet threaded through this history is humanity's dogged refusal to abandon its troubled minds. We keep trying, keep failing forward, keep rewriting the definition of care. Because ultimately, mental health care isn't about fixing broken brains, it's about rebuilding shattered lives. And that requires something no app can code, no drug can synthesize. The radical belief that every mind, no matter how wounded, deserves dignity and hope. After 5 millennia of trial and error, that truth remains our most important treatment protocol. While Western nations debate the ethics of AI therapy, nearly 2/3 of the world's population lacks access to basic mental health care, a disparity rooted in colonial medicine's lingering shadows. In Ghana, traditional healers still outnumber psychiatrists 200:1. In India, families hide schizophrenic relatives rather than face stigma. This isn't medieval ignorance, it's modern systemic neglect wearing different masks. The global mental health gap follows familiar colonial fault lines. 90% of psychiatric research focuses on 10% of the world's population. WHO estimates 75% of Africans with mental illness receive no treatment. Indonesia has 0.3 psychiatrists per 100,000 people, Germany, 18. Post-colonial nations inherited European asylum models ill-suited to local contexts. Zimbabwe's pioneering friendship benches, where grandmothers provide talk therapy in community spaces, demonstrate how decolonized care can outperform imported systems. Yet funding still flows overwhelmingly to Western-style clinics serving urban elites. Traditional healing practices, once dismissed as primitive, are being reevaluated through scientific lenses. Rwandan genocide survivors showed better outcomes with community reconciliation circles than clinical therapy. Amazonian ayahuasca ceremonies show promise for treatment-resistant depression. Korean Han psychotherapy addresses culturally specific trauma ignored by DSM criteria. But this cultural revival faces pharmaceutical colonialism, the aggressive marketing of Western drugs as universal solutions. Antidepressant sales in Brazil grew 400% in a decade. Indian parents sedate autistic children with off-label antipsychotics. African patients given outdated medications discontinued elsewhere. The treatment gap mirrors economic hierarchies. A depressed Norwegian can access free therapy, paid medical leave, a disability accommodations, while a Filipino fisherman with identical symptoms might get religious counseling, debt from lost work, possibly antipsychotic injections if symptoms escalate. Climate change intensifies these disparities. After disasters, wealthy nations deploy trauma counselors. Poor communities rely on spiritual leaders. Both approaches work, but only one gets research funding. Some nations are rewriting the playbook. Thailand trains Buddhist monks in suicide prevention. Nigeria's mobile clinics reach rural areas via motorcycle. Chile prioritizes community-based care over hospitalization. The bitter irony? Western nations now study these innovations as cost-effective solutions while still denying their legitimacy decades earlier. Global mental health remains a hall of mirrors where traditional knowledge is simultaneously appropriated and dismissed. Evidence-based often means Western-approved. Colonial power structures persist in prescription patterns. Perhaps the way forward lies in rejecting false binaries between clinical and traditional medicine, medication and spiritual healing, science and community wisdom. Because from Rwandan reconciliation benches to Brazilian capoeira therapy circles, one truth emerges. Healing happens where people feel seen and understood. And that fundamental human need transcends every historical era and cultural boundary we've constructed around it. The 21st century's real mental health revolution didn't come from a pharmaceutical lab or therapy couch. It emerged from fMRI machines mapping brain activity in vivid color. Neuroscience has given us something medieval exorcists and Freudian analysts never had: biological proof that mental illness leaves physical fingerprints. But with this power comes new ethical quandaries as sharp as any lobotomy scalpel. Modern brain imaging reveals depression alters the hippocampus like erosion sculpts coastline. PTSD rewires fear circuits like faulty electrical grids. Schizophrenia disrupts neural synchronization like static corrupts radio signals. These discoveries shattered centuries of stigma, proving mental illnesses aren't moral failures, but physiological conditions. Yet they've also spawned problematic trends. Overemphasis on chemical imbalance metaphors. Reduction of complex human suffering to brain scans. Commercial ventures selling dubious brain optimization schemes. The pharmaceutical industry capitalized on this shift brilliantly. SSRIs became household names not because they cured depression. They help about 50% of users, but because marketing framed them as insulin for diabetes, Prozac for depression. Correcting serotonin deficits, an oversimplified theory. Medicalizing ordinary sadness as treatable disorder. Meanwhile, cutting-edge treatments walk ethical tightropes. Deep brain stimulation implants electrodes to regulate mood, risking personality changes. Psychedelic-assisted therapy shows promise, but risks spiritual exploitation. CRISPR gene editing could prevent mental illness or enable eugenics. Neuroscience has also exposed therapy's biological mechanisms. CBT physically strengthens prefrontal cortex connections. Mindfulness meditation thickens gray matter. Social bonding releases oxytocin that heals trauma. This creates fascinating paradoxes. Ancient Buddhist practices now validated by MRI studies. Talk therapy proven to alter brain structures. Placebo effect measurable as neural activity. The diagnostic landscape is shifting beneath our feet. The DSM-5's categories increasingly clash with genetic research showing overlapping risk genes across disorders, brain imaging revealing spectrum-based conditions, patient reports that symptoms rarely fit textbook criteria. Some pioneers advocate dimensional models mapping, cognitive control capacities, emotional regulation ranges, social interaction continuums. Yet insurance companies still demand categorical diagnoses for reimbursement, forcing clinicians to squeeze fluid human experiences into rigid codes, pathologize normal variations to secure treatment, potentially miss underlying causes. The most promising development may be personalized medicine combining genetic testing, brain imaging, a lifestyle tracking, therapy modalities. Imagine a future where your treatment plan is as unique as your neural architecture. No more trial and error with medications, no generic therapy protocols. But this precision medicine risks becoming another privilege for the wealthy unless healthcare systems adapt. As neuroscience advances, we must guard against determinism, the idea that our brains dictate our destinies. Scans show neural patterns, not fixed fates. The same plasticity that lets trauma damage also enables healing. Perhaps the ultimate lesson from both ancient wisdom and modern science is this: while illness may shape us, it need not define us. As we stand at this crossroads between fMRI scans and ancient healing traditions, between algorithm-driven therapies and the irreducible mystery of human consciousness, perhaps the most radical insight emerges not from our technology, but from our history. The story of mental health care isn't a straight line from superstition to science. It's a spiral where we keep circling back to fundamental truths dressed in new vocabularies. The medieval village healer listening to troubled souls by firelight shares more with modern trauma therapists than either would suspect. The 19th century asylums chains have simply been replaced by today's chemical restraints and algorithmic diagnoses. Different tools, similar impulses to control what we fear. Even our gleaming neuroimaging labs echo ancient Greek physicians studying skull contours for signs of madness. Yet threaded through this imperfect history runs a stubborn, beautiful constant, the human capacity for healing connection. We now know, both through science and lived experience, that recovery happens in relationships. Whether it's a 14th century monk sitting with a delirious peasant, a World War I army nurse writing letters for shell-shocked soldiers, a modern peer support specialist sharing their recovery story, the mechanism remains the same. One suffering person extending hope to another. Our treatments will keep evolving. Tomorrow's therapies may involve neural nanobots repairing depression pathways, AI therapists available at 3 a.m. panic attacks, genetic vaccines against schizophrenia. But the core ingredients of healing haven't changed since the first shaman tended the first wounded spirit. Safety, dignity, witness, time. The greatest lesson from our tortured journey through mental health care's history is this: no treatment, no matter how scientifically advanced, can succeed without honoring these fundamentals. Not when we burned witches, not when we drilled skulls, not when we prescribed heroin for hysteria, and not when we reduced people to brain-skin datasets. So as we move forward, let's carry both humility and ambition. Humility from knowing how often we've been devastatingly wrong. Ambition from seeing how far compassion and curiosity have brought us. The future of mental health care shouldn't reject science in favor of tradition or tradition in favor of science, but synthesize the wisdom of both. Because after all these centuries, we're finally learning that healing minds requires more than fixing brains. It demands that we see each struggling person not as a problem to solve, but as a story to honor in all its complexity, pain, and unbreakable humanity. And that may be the one treatment protocol that never becomes obsolete.